Morning, everyone. Can we give a big hand to Brother D-Boy and Brother Bo? I heard that wow. Because it's hard to follow after two towering guys. So dinaan ko na lang po sa quote. How are you? Are you blessed that you're here? Can we give the Lord a big hand? Can you tell your neighbor right now, there's a blessing at the bottom?
There's a blessing at the bottom.
Yes, there is. There's a blessing at the bottom. To continue what Brother Bo has been preaching, I think it's so important for us to do this. We need to understand the context. Everybody say context.
Context.
We need to understand the context of how the author wrote this. Like what was happening in his life. We always say this whenever you read the Bible, the point of view. Like what was their worldview back then? How did they see the world? And it's very important because, we can all certainly agree that how we view the world today is so much different with how they viewed the world centuries ago. Now we can travel the world. Now we've got YouTube. We've got the internet. We've got news all over, local and international. We even got fake news. So how we see the world today is so much different from how they saw the world back then. In fact, let me give you an example. Whenever you see stormy waters or choppy waters out in the ocean, what's the first thing that you think of? There is a typhoon, or it's monsoon season, especially here in the country. We were used to that. It's mid-year here in the Philippines, and so we know that there's something that's coming. But to them, whenever there would be stormy waters, the first thing that they would think of? Pre-creation. The day that God created the world. That was their reference point. Because it says here, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. There was nothing. It was just darkness. And then darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. That's the reference point. Whenever they saw stormy waters, they would think pre-creation. There was chaos. There was nothing. There was darkness. So to the author who was writing this, nothing signified chaotic waters. And to them, chaotic waters was something that they feared. Why? Because they did not know what was underneath the water. Unlike now, we can scuba dive, we see the documentaries. They did not know, and so they feared water. To them, water represented death. It represented darkness. But there is another reference point. Again, the story of creation, where it says, "Then God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind." And then here it is. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. And I'm like, when I was reading this, hold on. Great sea creatures, and they're good? Whenever I think of those words, great sea creatures, you know what I think of? I think of the mosasaurus in Jurassic World. You remember that great creature? When I think of the word great sea creatures, I think of the megalodon. That prehistoric shark that can eat a whole boat. I think of the Kraken from the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. Yes, it might be a mythological figure, but guess what? They're not good. At least for the preservation of human life. For the longevity of life. They're not good. And yet God says, and He saw that it was good. Quick lesson. Your definition of good is not the same as God's definition of good. So sometimes when you see a person that you don't like, and that person is bad, God might think otherwise. Because God might say, I'm going to use that person. I'm going to use that person. You don't know what God's definition of good is. So it's so important for us, my friends, to always seek. Everybody say seek. Seek the truth from God's perspective, not from our limited, weak, worldly perspective. That's so important right now, especially right now with what's happening in our country. But let's continue. By this time, Jonah ends up in the belly of this great big fish. And then while he was inside, here's what Jonah does. He started praying. And then he said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and He answered me. And I called out to you from the land of the dead. And Lord, you heard me. And then he says this, you threw me into the ocean depths. and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me, and I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, "Oh Lord, you have driven me from your presence." You know, the first time that we preached this, we said that Jonah was fighting with the Ninevites. Now we're finding out that Jonah was not actually fighting with the Ninevites. He was fighting with God himself. This is Jonah saying, "You threw me. You have driven me from your presence. You threw me into the ocean depths." But then all of a sudden Jonah says this, "Yet I will look once more toward your holy temple." As he was sinking down in that watery grave, Jonah was still looking up at the holy temple of God, which is the highest point in dry ground. This is going to be important in a minute. And then it says in verse 5, "I sank beneath the waves and the waters closed over me." I wonder how many people here feel like that right now. You feel as though the waves are crashing over your life and you're being buried in this watery grave. And then it says, "Seaweed wrapped itself around my head." He's like human sushi. And then he says, "I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth whose gates locked shut forever. But you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false God turn their backs on all of God's mercies." And then Jonah says, "But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation," shout, "my salvation comes from the Lord alone." Let me give you very quickly the context of this prayer. It's a beautiful prayer, yes? But I want you to know that this is not an original prayer by Jonah. It's actually plagiarized. The author was plagiarizing. This is the beauty about the wisdom of the Bible, is that when you read the Bible, don't just read it from the surface level, but do your research, study. Because the author was pointing out something. Remember that this is a time, the ancient Jews, they knew their Bibles, the Hebrews, they knew the Bibles, they had it memorized, they understood it, they took it to heart. And so if you are the reader of this particular passage in the Bible, you know, this prayer sounds awfully familiar. I've heard this before. You know what he was pointing out to? He was linking it to the book of Psalms. A time when David was also fighting and running away from God. And so if you are the reader of this text, you're like, "Oh my goodness, Jonah is like David." This is how brilliant the author is. And one thing that I need to say, I love how the author inserted that prayer. Because one thing that it tells me is that, imagine, Jonah was inside the belly of this great big fish. I mean, it was complete darkness. Nothing, no light, no reading material. And yet, he knew that prayer. Why? Because it was here. He was close to God. That's why he knew the prayer.